let's talk about the sizing process, which is
Right.
PACE Equity has it streamlined. So when a sponsor comes directly to PACE Equity, um, typically you can do a really quick sizing off of
Right.
construction budget, a pro forma, really
Right.
a sponsor's resume, right? And you can really in a day's time turn around a indicative term sheet and do a sizing.
Absolutely.
Can you kind of talk about the underwriting or the sizing process,
Sure.
how you underwrite, the 5 pillars, and kind of go into that for the viewers here?
Absolutely. And by the way, Bo, this is like one of the biggest things at PACE Equity that, we take very seriously. We have 100% track record of what we size and engage with our clients to closing. And that's important because, if you think about this tool, as I mentioned, part of it is capital, right? What's the interest rate, right? How much, am I getting through the structure? But the other half, and the much harder half, frankly, is complying with all these vastly different state structuring requirements. So you could have the best term sheet in the world, but if you can't figure out or can't meet those requirements, it really doesn't matter. That's why we have this internal process for the engineering study, for complying with those state criteria, for going through the whole process to get all the approvals that are required from many different parties. So it's always good to understand that that's going to be a major factor as to how you're closing and achieving that capital is meeting those requirements. So going back to the 5 pillars, as you mentioned, we look at 5 different things in order to size our projects. And some of them are financial. So for example, we're looking for underwriting requirements that we have through our direct fund of, combined debt service coverage ratio. From an LTV, we like to be less than, say, 25% of the property value. We're looking for, some skin in the game, just like any lender would, of typically, 15%, thereabouts in our projects. So some of those are more, financial, so making sure they meet those requirements. But then we have things like eligible spend. That was a very specific term you yourself used, whereby we have to fund the specific items in the budget that meet those state law criterias: HVAC, lighting, windows, roof and envelope, solar, geothermal, sometimes seismic improvements. So if we're looking to fund, say, $2 million, there has to be $2 million of those specific schedule of value trades in order to achieve that. The 5th pillar then is what those state criteria say. In Wisconsin, which is where we're based, we have an energy savings requirement to comply with. So we have to make sure that there's going to be enough energy savings off your current design. That's an important thing I want to come back to, in order to meet those criteria. Some states have those, some states don't. Some states have a percentage of cost and kind of a complex formula to get there. So we look at all those things, very individually and specifically, trying to find kind of the lowest common denominator. What is going to pull your project down? That's what we really focus on to make sure that we're sizing appropriately. Now, if I can talk about, your project design as well. So a lot of our clients that we're speaking with who haven't worked with us in the past ask us, this is great, but I don't know that I'm building a really efficient, really sustainable building. And, in a sense, I'd like to, or some would like to, not everyone does, and that's okay, of course. But I really want to build my building the way I'd like to build it. So I don't want to have to go LEED or something like that. That's the magic of PACE Equity, Bo, is that we enable our clients to build the buildings they want to build without any design changes. And we'll size up our funding to achieve that. So sometimes what that means is that we may fund a little bit less in some states that have these stricter requirements than maybe the sponsor would like, but they're maintaining their design. We can help in order to work through the design process if someone's interested in that to get to a higher funding or a higher efficient building without, say, driving up costs materially. That's another part of our engineering process that we can do. We can identify little changes that drive major efficiency, but not major cost.
And typically with, there are some competitors out there, but PACE Equity's advantage in the marketplace is that you're a true turnkey provider, meaning everything is done in-house. With other providers, you have to go outsource engineers. You have to, jump through these 80 steps to get to the finish line, where PACE Equity has streamlined the process, and it's kind of the pioneer, right? We've done the first ground up construction project. Kind of talk about some of the kind of paving that PACE Equity has done in the marketplace a little bit here.
Sure. So we are, and you're absolutely right. There's a couple of firms out there that do the funding portion of PACE. And by the way, they're great people. It's just a different approach that they're taking than we've taken. From our chair, the hard part about PACE is that work, that structuring, engineering, qualifying work. There's 100 steps to do in order to really get serious about funding a project. And until those are done, you can't really firm up what the funding is unless you're working with someone who basically has this 100% track record of saying, here's what we can do, and then actually achieving that through our turnkey process. And what that means, though, we are the largest and most experienced CPACE lender and project developer when it comes to construction, ground up construction and development projects, historic tax credits, redevelopment projects. We've done the most, and as you said, we really paved the way. We funded the first new construction, which was a ground up hotel here in Milwaukee, the first redevelopment to use historic tax credits, new markets, opportunity zones. That's really where our bailiwick is. And look, we'd love to do any kind of project, where it makes sense. If it's just adding solar to a building, we love those projects too. But where I'd say we can add the most value to our clients is in those complex, from a financing standpoint, complex from a construction standpoint, development projects.
Excellent. And so on retrofit deals, can you give an example of a recent retrofit deal where a building owner wanted to do some updates and renovations to increase efficiencies, increase value of the property? Can you just talk about a recent project, like the capabilities? It's not just for ground up construction and development.
Absolutely.
And then can you also dive into talking about what property types work for PACE?
Yeah, absolutely. We funded an office renovation project here in Milwaukee last year, whereby the owner was buying it from a long-time, ownership group. And what was interesting about this, it was an office building, and it was 100% gross leases. So the owner, in that case, they're paying all the utility bills, all the expenses for that building. And what's interesting about this scenario is that even with all that incentive, they were still using, non-LED lighting, like a 50-year-old chiller system, and really old elevators. So this owner said, you know what, I will pocket this. And this is not, really invasive or really high cost work. This was, maybe less than $500,000 of work, but doing that enabled them to capture all of that increased efficiency, and actually net of our payment, they are cash flow positive day one, year one, right out the gate by doing that. So there's a lot of different types of properties where we see those retrofit renovation projects, whether it's to simply increase cash flow, whether it's right now to add to your tenant's comfort. If you're funding an HVAC project, we could also incorporate indoor air quality, have people come back to the office or to the distribution center or your retail, strip center, with increased, comfort from that perspective. Maybe it's just to, do a little TLC. It's a competitive leasing market. You need to do some refreshing. A lot of that is going to fall into these categories that we can fund, and just like in this project, adds a lot of value to the building. And you had asked what kind of projects we fund. So really any kind of commercial project, including multifamily of 5 units or greater. So multifamily, office, hospitality, industrial, retail, senior. We're seeing a lot of senior living projects that we're funding as well. A lot of what we fund today is hospitality, multifamily, and senior, with a smattering of, office, industrial, retail, thereabouts thereafter.
And we're seeing a lot more of like adaptive reuse projects too. And I would assume that that's going to continue as kind of, the use of the building is kind of obsolete now. Is that kind of, do you think that's going to be the emerging trend to come out in the next couple of years?
I do. I think you're going to see a lot of these, older type of buildings that were struggling pre-COVID aren't going to, haven't made it or aren't making it, unfortunately, through COVID. And so they need to change use, and we're seeing a lot of older hotels and older office buildings that, in a sense, it's what from a positive standpoint, that are getting heavy investment and being brought back to life as alternative uses. We are just working on closing an adaptive reuse of a former, hotel into senior assisted living in suburban Detroit. And again, these are great stories to tell, where you can take, a closed, shuttered asset, not doing a lot, for the city and for the tax base. And, in this case, it's a $20-something million project that we're supporting with about $3.5 million of funding to see it, transform and really bring back, that part of that block and community.
So I met with a developer yesterday, and he says, after I gave him the high level overview of the benefits, he says, what are the cons? What are the downsides of PACE equity? And I said, well, really, there aren't many, because higher leverage, pretty inexpensive cost of capital, long-term non-recourse debt. And if it's a construction project, right, the first 2 years are capitalized, which is like kind of having an interest reserve for people that don't know what capitalized is. And so I would say, what are the downsides that you do see is, one, maybe the city or county or townships not opted in, and it might be a little bit of a lengthy process to get, if it's enabled in the state, but maybe not in the city or county, and you would have to get on the ballot to get approved, right? So that could be a little bit of a time consuming. But if it's an opted in city, we're closing transactions in 60 days.